people in today's gospel asking Jesus for signs so that they could believe in him. Today we'll say a few words on this gospel of St. John, known as the Bread of Life discourse. I'll preface it by saying I probably said most of these things before in another homily, but when you do get older, you tend to repeat yourself, as some of us know, so please be patient with me. St. Bonaventure, in his book, The Journey of the Mind into God, said that the created world is like a stairway that we can use to climb towards God. He called the world, quote, a mirror through which we pass over to God. It's actually a very beautiful phrase. So that the created world is a mirror through which we pass over to God. What does he mean by that? He means that the beauty and the order and the goodness that we see in things is like a signpost that's meant to point us to the one who created those things. It's almost like a wedding ring, in the sense that a wedding ring is a sign or a symbol of love that someone has for their spouse, but it's not the spouse itself. I don't think that anyone has ever confused their wedding ring for their spouse. Typically a spouse doesn't go to bed and kiss their wedding ring goodnight as if it was their spouse. They could do that maybe if the spouse isn't at home as a remembrance of their love, but when the spouse is in front of them and if they're kissing their wedding ring goodnight, that is a sign that something's probably not right in that relationship. It's a bit weird. No, the wedding ring is actually meant to be a symbol, and it's meant to point to your spouse and point to the bond of love that exists between the two of you. It's not a substitute for your spouse. Likewise, creation is meant to point to our heavenly spouse, who's God himself. It's not meant to be a substitute for God. We can say that creation points to him, and grace is like that ring that we wear, symbolizing that we belong to him and that he belongs to us. Grace is an invisible ring, obviously, but it's transmitted to us through visible signs and gestures and words and materials, the things that we call the sacraments. So creation, again, is meant to raise our minds and our thoughts and hopefully at the same time our hearts to God, and grace is what unites us to him. Created things can also be seen as symbols of spiritual realities, not just pointing to God, but also symbolizing spiritual truths. For example, we look at the sun. The sun is like a symbol of Christ, the Son of God, who gives light to the world, as he says in John 8:12. He says, I am the light of the world. I thought, if you ever hear anyone come up to you and say that, I am the light of the world, either you've got God himself in front of you, or it's a person who it's probably good to call the police because they probably escaped from an asylum. In that case, it would actually be an act of charity to call the police. In Jesus' case, he says, I am the light of the world. When he says it, it's actually true. He is God himself. So the sun that we see shining in the sky, we can say, is a symbol of Christ, the sun who shines in the darkness, as the apostle says in John 1:5. Even darkness that we experience at night, that has a spiritual meaning too. It's a symbol of spiritual darkness. It's a symbol of how we can have eyes but still not see in a spiritual sense, just like we can't see things in the dark at night. Spiritual writers say that when we're walking in spiritual darkness, it means either that we're in a state of sin, or it can feel like we're walking in spiritual darkness when we just aren't experiencing God's presence or his consolations. So physical darkness has a spiritual, it has a symbolic meaning as well. Or we can look at water, another example. Water is a symbol of the sacrament of baptism. It's also a symbol of the Holy Spirit, whom Jesus says is the living water. He says that in John 7, verses 38 and 39. Water is also a symbol of spiritual cleansing, of purification, etc. I think you can do that with any created reality, trees, animals, rocks. We even heard the psalmist say today in the responsorial psalm, he said, you are my rock and my fortress, he said to the Lord, Psalm 31, verse 4. And whatever reality we know, we can see that behind that, in some sense, there's always a spiritual truth that we can discover. St. Terrance even did that with elevators, for example, saying that she found an elevator to God in her spiritual search. The elevator was spiritual childhood, what she called, which meant, what did it mean? It meant remaining little in her heart and counting on the Lord to pick her up and bring her to himself, just like an elevator does with people. All of that brings us to the Blessed Sacrament. The Blessed Sacrament is the only created thing or reality that I'm aware of that does two things. One, it points to God, and two, it is God at the same time. Well, in truth, there's also the sacred humanity of Jesus, which pointed to God in a visible way and contained God, or better, it was perfectly united to God at the same time. I may not be phrasing that in the best way, theologically speaking, but I think the gist of it can be understood. Not only does the Blessed Sacrament point us to God, as all created things are meant to do in one way or another, but it contains God. It is God because it is the person of Jesus Christ. And the Blessed Sacrament contains within it all grace as well, so that when we receive Jesus in the Holy Eucharist, we're uniting ourselves totally to our heavenly spouse, which is actually the greatest desire of the heart of Jesus. His greatest desire for us is to be totally united to him. We heard Jesus say in the Gospel, "I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will never hunger," John 6:35. So when the doors of our churches and chapels eventually open up again, let's come to Jesus in the sacraments, particularly in the Blessed Sacrament. Let's learn to also receive him with a humble and a grateful heart as well, even more so than perhaps in the past when we perhaps took him for granted before this extended lockdown period. Let's also ask Our Lady, Mother of the Most Blessed Sacrament, for the grace to see behind the veil of things, for the grace to see God's hand in the things that he has made, and for the grace to hear his voice speaking to us each day, and for the grace to recognize her beloved Son, Jesus, truly present in the Blessed Sacrament.